Joe, you always rock the house.
Now, I'm very honored to introduce our next guest. Again, he's probably someone who doesn't need too much introduction from me, a very minor one. So I'd like to introduce Dr. David Suzuki.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today, but I'm afraid, being an old professor, I'm going to give you a serious lecture today. If you were to assess what society's priorities are by the amount of space devoted to them in newspapers or television news reports, I think you'd very quickly realize that Canadians are obsessed with politics, business, sports, and celebrity. And yet none of these is nearly as important in terms of determining the way that we live than science. Science, when applied by industry, medicine, and the military. I was born in 1936. When I was a boy, my mom and dad didn't worry that I was watching too much television because there was no television when I was a boy. They would let me go to movies or public swimming pools in the summer because they were afraid I would catch polio. When I was a boy, hundreds of thousands of people died every year of smallpox. These are things that smallpox and polio are things our kids today have no idea what they are. When I was a boy, there were no transcontinental phone calls, there were no satellites, there were no birth control pills. I could go on and on and on. Certainly no cell phones or text messaging. The world has changed enormously as a result of the application of science and technology. Science provides the fundamental insights that we need that may lead to the application of those ideas. But far more important, I believe, science provides us with a description of the way the world works. Scientists are always making new discoveries. Why? Because we know so little. We look out and we try to discover more about how the world works. Science, not politics or corporations, provide by far the best assessment of the way the world works and the information that we need to decide how we must act. As you know, we now have a Prime Minister intent on pushing through the pipeline across British Columbia. Before all of the scientific information, the assessment is even in. We don't make informed decisions that way. We have to assess the information available. But what we are now is we're threatened with politicians deciding not only whether or not to listen to scientists, but the kind of information that scientists are allowed to tell us about. When we shut down research, such as the experimental lakes area, and I have to tell you as a scientist, this is the most baffling thing for the government to do. It makes absolutely no sense. Canada has such a small place in the global scientific community anyway. Why on earth would we shut down one of the gems of science in this country? It makes no sense. But when we shut that down, or when we shut down the polar expeditions to discover the effect of climate change, then politicians have nothing to counter the decisions that they make. So it may make political sense, it doesn't make any other kind of sense. The great strength of science is its openness to scrutiny, to examination, and self-correction in the end. You know that some of the leading climatologists 40 years ago, looking at the evidence at that time, thought maybe we were headed for a climate cooling episode. But then when the data became became stronger and our theories were much more sophisticated, it became clear, no, we were not going into a cooling, we were going into a period of global warming. But of course, that's always raised as, see those scientists? They used to say it was cooling, now they say it's heating. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. It's got no relevance. That's the very nature of science itself, the process. And we should understand that as we begin to assess scientific input. But I think that our government is acting as if out of sight, out of mind. No, they don't want to hear anything that will counter the kind of political or economic agendas that they have. How can we make an informed decision on the future of the Northern Gateway pipeline and the consequences of a major oil spill if we don't have the best scientific evidence that we have today? How can we make a decision about the impact of climate change on permafrost and the release of giant clothrates of methane in the Arctic? How can we make an informed decision as we look at vanishing caribou, at polar bears, or at grizzlies? How do we examine the effect of pollination or the future of pollination if we don't know the science behind the effect of pesticides on pollinators? How will we judge the hazards or the benefits of GMOs without science? How can we talk about the future of the acidification of oceans without science? It seems to me, and I could list dozens of issues like this that impinge on our daily lives. We need more science. We face an increasingly difficult and uncertain future because scientists and populations have suddenly increased and changed in our relationship with the Earth. There has never been 1 billion mammals of any species on the planet until we reached 1 billion people around 1803. We now have 7 billion. This is unprecedented. We have a gigantic ecological footprint, but we now have amplified that with technology. Technology that enables us to attack any part of the planet in a search for raw materials and to spread our waste and toxic material all over the planet. And of course, you and I have become unbelievable consumers, and everything that we consume comes out of the earth, and there's an ecological impact of that. And we've now bought into a global economy that does what? Provides us with this profusion of products in which the ecological and social consequences of those products are no longer visible. When you buy a Toyota car, do you ever ask, where did all the metals come from that make up this car? What was the impact on the people that were mining, the people that lived in those? We don't ask those questions. When we buy a cotton shirt, you know, we may want the brand on the shirt, but do you ever ask, where was this cotton grown? Is it organic? Cotton is one of the most chemically intensive crops that we grow. And if you look at the consequences of growing cotton on a massive scale, it's been an ecological and social disaster. But globalization hides all of that. We just go into a store, I want a product, lay my money down, and we get it back. And we no longer see what scientists could tell us about the impact. Collectively, human beings have become an unprecedented force on the planet itself. We are now altering the chemistry, the physics, and the biology of the biosphere on a geological scale. That's why scientists refer to this as the Anthropocene epoch, the era in which humans have become a geological force. And in the process, with this power, we are undermining the very things that keep us alive and healthy. And that is the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food that comes from the soil, the energy that comes from photosynthesis and biodiversity. Those are the fundamental things that we need to stay alive and healthy. In an increasingly uncertain future, the best thing we have to guide us into that future is facts. Facts, and the best information we get comes from science. We have now seen what this government is all about. It canceled the long-form census. Why? Because people should have the freedom to choose what they do or do not do. Freedom comes with responsibility. And part of that is taking part in these censuses that will provide government and society with an input on where we are at this point and how we can guide ourselves into the future. We have a government that opposes safe injection sites in spite of the knowledge that it saves lives. We have a government that has canceled the long gun registry despite law enforcement officers across the country saying that it works if you have the registration. We have a government, the Harper government, that that wants to expand the prison system in spite of the fact that crime rates are dropping. Now, I'm not a guy that tends to think that there are all these obscure things that are going on we don't know about, but quite frankly, are we expanding the prison system because the Harper government intends to create new areas of criminality? How about eco-terrorists? How about radical extremists? Is that what's going to fill our jails in the coming years? Okay, sorry, I've gone on too long. If we can ignore science, then we can ignore the reality of rising oceans, of the spread of new diseases, of more serious fires, of drought and floods in Calgary and Toronto. After the very unusual flood in Calgary, the Prime Minister's wife was filmed helping the flood victims and turned the camera and said, "Oh, we Calgarians, we're tough. There are floods here all the time. You know, we're used to this." Duh! If there are floods all the time, why don't you do something to stop it, for Christ's sake? And maybe climate change has got something to do with it. Canada, of all industrialized countries, is the most vulnerable country to the consequences of climate change. We have the longest marine coastline of any country in the world. And when water warms, it expands. Thermal expansion of the oceans alone is going to cause our shores to increase in size. There are huge economic consequences of that. We are a country in which we are a northern country, and we know from Inuit people for over 20 years that the Arctic is changing because of climate change. And do you think our economy doesn't depend on climate-sensitive areas like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, sports, winter sports, or ecotourism, for God's sakes? Anybody who cares about the economy is being irresponsible in ignoring the consequences of climate change. I believe that the muzzling of science represents a government that is willfully blind. And in our culture, you can throw people into jail if they occupy positions of power and they decide to ignore areas or information they should know about. I accuse our government of willful blindness, and we ought to think about that. But more importantly, I accuse our government of a crime against future generations. There is an intergenerational crime going on. So I say to Canadians, take back our government. Let's have more democracy. Get the hell out there and vote.
Thank you, David. I think the roof just blew off the Environment Canada building down the street. I'd like to invite Finn Donnelly, who is a member of